This is a tutorial on the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure and agreement. This form is required by the state of California if the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard zone. Well, how do you know if it is? Well, you look at the NHD report, which is also required by law in California. And this is a standardized page on a fast NHD, and it shows right here, yes. So if you see a yes here, that it's in a high or very high fire hazard zone, or a yes down here, well, you know that you need to do the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure. Now, we have this form fillable in our professional forms manager for Cavor agents, but if you don't have access, you can always go to fastnhd.com. Under resources, you'll see the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure. Click on it. It brings you to this page. There is a free fillable PDF that you can use on your transaction right there. So this is what we're looking at. Now, it looks like a lot, but it's quite simple, and I'll show you how to fill this out. You'll start by putting in the property address here, and then it tells you that there are basically two forms in one: the fire hardening disclosure and the defensible space disclosure and agreement. And these are required by law, and they're condensed into this one document to kind of simplify it because the concepts overlap. And it also tells you the qualifiers, that the property is in a high or very high fire hazard zone, and it was constructed before 2010. Now, if it was constructed on or after January 1st, 2010, well, you can skip section A. But we're going to pretend that it is in a high fire hazard zone and it was built before 2010. And we'll jump right into the first part where it tells you some of this. This is all statutory verbiage that comes straight from the law. And then it goes down to vulnerability features. Now, note here it says seller is aware if these features exist. Now, sellers get hung up on this. Well, what if it exists and I don't know about it? And then I put no. Isn't that wrong? Well, no, it's asking if you're aware, if the seller is aware. If the seller doesn't know, then the answer is no. People get hung up on this, but it's actually quite simple. So you'll check yes or no if the seller's aware. And when I say you, I'm referring to the seller. Their representative does not fill this out. The seller fills this out. And then the seller is going to initially move on to the next part, low cost retrofit disclosure. And now it's asking, were any of these items below in this list 1 through 12 completed during the seller's ownership? Again, the seller is going to know, because if they know that it was, they put yes. And if they have no idea, they put no. And then just read through here and check the respective box. Quite simple. Then it asks if the seller has obtained an inspection report, and they'll check the appropriate box. We are now done with the first disclosure. That's section A right here. Now we're going to this section B, which is the defensible space disclosure. Now, same idea. There's qualifiers here, but note there's no date qualifier. So it doesn't matter when the home was built. All that matters is if it's in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So let's say that it is. Okay, well, now we need to go down and do this next section that begins right here with this number 6, tells you about it. So it's going to initial and move down to here. It asks if the seller's obtained documentation about defensible space compliance, and the seller's going to answer. All right. Simple stuff. Now, once you answer, you're going to move down here, and it's going to ask more questions. And this ties in whether or not the seller knows if there is a local ordinance that pertains to hardening the surroundings of the property. And so the seller needs to just read this and not overthink it. It's pretty simple. Is there a local ordinance that the seller's about? Now, most places have a local ordinance, and the seller's going to check that box if they're aware of it. And if there's really no ordinance, they're going to check that box. And if the seller doesn't know, they're going to check this box, okay? Then we come down here, and it's going to ask what the buyer, basically this is asking if the buyer's going to take responsibility with complying with the local ordinance in the future. And so the more likely or typical answer here, and by the way, there's a qualifier, if the seller checked no in the above section A. So that's asking if the seller has not obtained documentation, which is typically what happens. The seller has not obtained documentation here. Rarely does a seller have documentation on hand. So almost always the seller's going to do this C. And what's likely going to be done is the seller's going to check this box that there is a local ordinance, but the buyer is going to agree to comply with it after the close of escrow, meaning that the property sells, it's the buyer's owner, the buyer's the owner, it's the buyer's responsibility. They're going to run with it. This is the most common outcome. Now, maybe there's no local ordinance, but That's very unusual. I'm just showing you what's typical. Now, if the seller has obtained documentation, maybe in some instance, the seller got a notice that they needed to have all sorts of vegetation removed or cut back around their property, and they complied and they have its documentation about this. They can check this box and they can write the source of the documentation right there and then initial, and then we're done. That's it. Seller's going to sign. We're at the end of this 4-page document, and now you know how to prepare the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure and agreement. Thanks for watching.